Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this very important webinar that I'm very happy to host from the European Parliament in Brussels. The war in Ukraine has changed Europe. The needless devastation and loss of life will have ramifications long into the future, and the EU must be ready to meet the challenges of a changing world. Although this crisis is at our doorstep, we cannot forget other very consequential issues occurring simultaneously. Last August, footage of tragic scenes in Afghanistan caught the world's attention, with desperate crowds running alongside a US military plane as it prepared to depart Kabul. Our initial shock at how rapidly the Taliban seized control has passed, but this atmosphere of desperation and fear in Afghanistan has not. The Taliban made many empty promises after their takeover, that they would offer full amnesty to Afghans who worked for the Western-backed government and uphold women's rights. No sooner were these promises made than they were broken. Since they seized power, the Taliban have implemented a series of severe restrictions on rights and freedoms, particularly those of women and girls. The Taliban's extensive human rights abuses in Afghanistan are evident, and millions of people who have remained in the country for the past several months have endured a significant amount of suffering. In March, girls finally returned to schools with the expectation that they would be able to continue their education at long last. However, they were let down once again. As a former teacher, I am horrified by this denial of education, and by extension, denial of a future. Education has long been recognised as one of the most fundamental human rights. However, the reality is, for far too many young people across the world, they are still being denied access to an education today. It was inspiring to see the young women in Afghanistan protesting for their right to education in Kabul recently, after schools were shut again. The same can be said for brave television presenters who refused to cover their faces on camera and their colleagues who supported them. However, the international community must do more to ensure that girls in Afghanistan are not denied this fundamental right. Here in the European Union, the right to education is enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, but we should increase the pressure on the Taliban for promises to be kept and basic rights to be facilitated. Education is the key to future prosperity and health, and it is crucial that we continue to help the people in Afghanistan in that regard. Today, we're fortunate enough to have some truly excellent speakers that can speak on the current situation and the impact the new regime is having on the people of Afghanistan. I would like to take this opportunity to thank them for being here today, and more broadly, for the important work they all do. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to highlight a case that I have been personally involved in, which is separate to this event here today. I am in contact with a woman and her family in Afghanistan who tell me of their precarious situation, with their rights and freedoms severely restricted. She lives under a constant cloud of fear, with opportunities for prosperity stripped, replaced with isolation. In this regard, I am supporting a campaign to help get the family to safety. We have set up a GoFundMe account to help finance this, the link of which is in your email invite or can be found on my social media channels. Any donation, no matter how small, will be greatly appreciated. It is a pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Humaira Razai, who is chair of the Hazara Committee in the United Kingdom and is involved in human rights activism. She relocated to the United Kingdom from Afghanistan at the age of 13 and holds a PhD in medicine. Keynote address now from Dr. Humaira Razai. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you so much for having me here in this very important and timely panel discussion. And my appreciation, of course, extends to yourself and the team for organizing this. From the day that Taliban took over Afghanistan, they have focused their policies on women and restricting women. Women and girls do not have access to education. They're not allowed to work. They're not allowed to travel alone. And girls above the age of 12 are not allowed to school. Their policies are dangerous and are detrimental not only to the country, but also to the region and the world. The Taliban have institutionalized discrimination against women, where they're denying their fundamental rights. As for education, Taliban have changed school curriculum, reducing study hours or removing subjects such as social sciences and focusing the school curriculum on religion and more specifically the teaching of the school of Hanafi. We have to remember that we have many other religious groups in Afghanistan. With the limited number of schools and resources available for schools, the number of madrasas is increasing in the country. We know that education was always used as a political tool in Afghanistan. And now with the Taliban in power, there's a huge risk that the education system will be used to breed and produce terrorists in Afghanistan. This is a security threat to the world. I grew up during the first Taliban regime in Afghanistan. As a Hazara and as a woman, I vividly remember their cruelty, violence, and the impact of their policies that I still have to live with today. I couldn't go to school because I was a girl, and now to know that girls are going through the same as what I did is truly heartbreaking. The Taliban are at war with women because they know that women in Afghanistan have changed. From the day that they took power by force, they have been coming up with new laws to restrict women further. But they have failed to show any strategy even for basic provision of social services. We know that they removed Ministry of Women Affairs and replaced it with Ministry of Vice and Virtue. Women do not have access to justice or any legal system. Female judges, lawyers, human rights defenders are all removed from any legal system with no mechanism to protect women in Afghanistan. The lack of freedom of expression, particularly for women, means that they cannot raise their voice. With the intimidation and harassment, they are removing women from television, journalism, anything that gives women a voice. Recently, they forced female journalists to cover their face, and more shockingly, they have asked little schoolgirls from the grade of 2 to 6 to cover their face. But Sean, when we talk about gender-based issues and feminism, we often talk about intersectionality. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences and discrimination and oppression. For Afghanistan, we must look at different factors that marginalizes people, specifically women. We must take into account every single thread of society, history, culture, international politics, geopolitics, as well as class, gender, and race that shapes their situation. And so it's important that we sort of look at the past 30 to 40 years and evaluate the situation of women in Afghanistan and what can be done to ensure that the effort we have put for women's rights in Afghanistan does not go to waste. The lack of action by the international community is pushing women in Afghanistan further into desperation every day. They need our help and support to ensure that all women across Afghanistan have their basic human rights again. And as I said, when we try to address the situation in Afghanistan, we have to take many factors into consideration. And I think women in Afghanistan, for example, in southern Afghanistan, are very different to women in northern Afghanistan. There are families in southern Afghanistan who have welcomed Taliban and the way that they're ruling Afghanistan. But of course, we see women in northern Afghanistan, central Afghanistan, and Hazarajat who have been resisting by any forms possible. And so when we try to address the situation, especially gender-based issues, we have to look at these factors and we have to address specific issues with specific solution. And I mentioned the Hazara women, and Hazaras are an ethnic group in Afghanistan and are actually categorized as one of the most persecuted group of people in the world. They have been colonized internally. 62% of the Hazara population was massacred between 1891 to 1893, and they were enslaved up until 1920s. Hazara faced another genocide during the first Taliban regime, and I was in Afghanistan at that time. And many human rights organizations and experts have warned that Hazaras are at risk of another genocide under the Taliban regime. Hazaras are getting persecuted mainly for three reasons. History, as I mentioned, that they have been getting persecuted and oppressed since 1890s. Religion, because majority of Hazaras are Shia sect of Islam, although we also have Sunnis, Ismailis, Christians, and secular. Also because of their values. When we look at women in Afghanistan in the past 20 years, we can see that Hazara women spearheaded the civil development in Afghanistan. From the first female minister to governor to a mayor have all been Hazara women. Even the first female athletes to go and compete in the Olympics was a Hazara woman. And so Hazaras have been targeted because of the values that they hold in Afghanistan. And these values were fortunately historic. When we look at histories, there's a book by Jonathan Lee, apologies, by Captain John Woods, where he says that when he visited the Hazaras in Afghanistan, he says the Hazara women and men are equal in a society where this was in the 1800s. But we have a very clear picture of what the Taliban are capable of. We're dealing with a group of terrorists who showcase their brigade of suicide attackers with pride. And so with the help of ICC and using international mechanism, we have to bring accountability and justice in Afghanistan. Otherwise, they will continue to commit crimes against humanity in Afghanistan. Since 2021, there has been over 30 attacks targeting just the Hazaras in Afghanistan. Just in the past 5 months, there was nearly 10 attacks just in districts in Kabul, in Dasht-e-Barchi. That means if someone is in Afghanistan or in Dasht-e-Barchi, there's a chance that they will face attack. I will end here. I will give time to other colleagues, but I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Dr. Humaira, thank you very much for that. A very relevant but also heartbreaking account of what the reality is, and indeed the urgency of getting action at world level on this particular issue. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Abdul Aziz Mohibi, who was Chancellor at Bevan University in Afghanistan until 2021. He holds a PhD in Agriculture and Environmental Engineering, specializing in natural resource management, disaster risk reduction, land use and land cover. Dr. Mohibi has recently relocated to Ireland with his family, and we are happy to have them with his wealth of knowledge and experience. Over to you now, Dr. Abdul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me, Sean Kelly. And as we are talking about women and girls of Afghanistan, and the 9-month Taliban have reversed what Afghan, together with their international allies, have achieved over 20 years' time through enormous human and material investment and sacrifices. Nowhere the Taliban has been as brutal as Afghan women and Afghan women's rights. The Taliban have targeted almost every aspect of women's life. They have dismantled key institutions driving women upward movement. They formulated draconian codes and conduct guidelines stripping women of basic freedom. They have shut down women business and enterprises. They have banned women from secondary education. They have physically targeted women who voiced their protests. Women's sense of safety and security is shattered. No woman felt safe in Afghanistan. Every woman outside of their house is a potential target for the Taliban. This is how Afghan women in Afghanistan, after international community abandoned it, and Ashraf Ghani and his governing team fled Kabul. I want to focus on 4 parts in this talk. One is the smelting of key women institutions, as Dr. Razai also mentioned about that. Repressive rules, edicts, and code of conduct Taliban have passed. Targeting of women such as murder, abduction, torture, and disappearance. And couple point what can be done. The smelting of key women institutions as Taliban took over Kabul, one of the first steps they took was the dissolution of Ministry of Women Affairs, an institution that symbolized both women's struggles and women's achievement over the past 20 years. To mark their outright hostility toward women and their determination to systematically reverse women's rights, the Taliban not only dismantled this ministry, they changed this ministry to the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, which is, this ministry is the heart of serious decision on separation of women's rights in Afghanistan. And another institution is Independent Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan, another key institution embodying progress and women's and human rights in the country. Taliban tragically in 17 May 2022 announced it is dismantling. Repressive rules, edict, and code of conduct, including women work and education, which they did in Afghanistan. In November last year, Taliban has issued 8 articles, directive on media, which also banned women from appearing on comic and performance arts-based shows. On 26 December, the Taliban Ministry of Vice and Virtue issued a guideline that taxi drivers must not play music and not give right to women. And recently, in Kandahar area, the Taliban announced that do not give right the women accompanying to taxi because it will cause corruption or lead to corruption. And this is funny thing. On 31st January, the Taliban intelligence official at Herat Information and Culture Department had instructed that the media not to hear women's voices in any form through media platform. The Taliban prevent girls from secondary education in the country as they took over Kabul. On 26 March, the Taliban denied dozens of Afghan women boarding national and international flights at Kabul because they were not accompanying with legitimate means or male. In May, the Taliban instructed all female journalists and president to wear masks or cover all their face or body. On the other hand, the killing, abduction, torture, and disappearing. There is dozens of examples, but I will tell you a few of them. At 3rd and 4th January, Mursal Ayyar and Zahra Mohammadi. 19 January, Zarmina Zaryab, Paryani, Parwana Ibrahim Khel. On 17 February, the Taliban abducted Marjan Amiri. And all these ladies, which I gave their name, they were abducted. On 16 April, 2 women in Firozkoh city of War province were beaten up in public because they were wearing jeans. See how they acting and how they are doing. In early September 2021, the Taliban attacked women protesters in Mazar-e-Sharif city, detaining 70 protesters, including 40 girls. 1 week on from the protest, dead bodies of 8 protesters were stolen away on different parts of the city. And this is really sad. Let's talk about a couple of points we can do. How can there's, opportunities we can provide for them or we can try to avoid. Provide robust support into investigation of incidents of violence, including murder, abduction, and torture, identifying the criminals and call for justice and accountability. Provide robust support and protection to women leaders and defenders who put their lives at risk, defending women's rights under exceeding difficult circumstances. Reciprocal measure should be put in place against Taliban decision. It should start from restricting travel of Taliban officials, and also should be monitored their budget, where it's come from. It should be under strong monitoring. Any negotiation full recognition on respect to women's rights should be a non-negotiable red line principle and prerequisite. Women's right to participate in media, organization, and civil society should be robustly supported and protected. Help girls and women of Afghanistan continue their education, raise their voice through the use of technology, cluster education, and professional training and education. Provide funding for international education, internationally or internally, and provide support for those international, they are supporting Afghan women. I want to give a little bit information about cluster education and its example in 2 countries. One is Iran, Baha'i nation, which they were in Iran. They was getting education. Religious education. There was underground kind of education that was separated in different areas, but they was taking education underground, which the government was not seeing them how they can get education, but that was kind of method which they were getting the education. It is called cluster education. And another kind is an example and also experience. My father was the head of education in one district in Afghanistan. In previous time of Taliban, when Taliban in 1999 and 2000, when they were in Bamiyan, they had a kind of, my father and their colleagues, they had a kind of system. They're giving education to the children, especially for the girls, hidden from the Taliban seeing or from the Taliban, and that was kind of under radar of Taliban. They divided the girls in different areas, and what they was teaching them that we are teaching religious things, but actually they were teaching the formal education like mathematics, things like that. And if there is any question regarding the thought which I had, I will be happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Mohibi, for a really interesting account, adding to what we already heard, and the terrible situation facing women in Afghanistan. You brought it home very clearly to us. So now our third and final speaker, we're very happy to have another excellent speaker, Emer Law, who is RT foreign editor, a very accomplished and experienced and much admired journalist. Emer has reported on many important topics across the world, but she has recently returned from a trip to Afghanistan, where she saw firsthand the impact of the lack of women's rights, including the lack of access to education for women and girls. Over to you, Emer, and thanks for coming.
Thanks very much, Sean. Hello, everybody. And I have to say a big thank you to Sean for organising today's webinar. I think we can all agree that this is a hugely important issue, but sadly it's not getting the attention that it warrants. We all remember the scenes that Sean spoke about in his introduction during last summer when the Taliban tore across Afghanistan. And it's hard to believe that less than a year later, that horror has been eclipsed by yet another gut-wrenching story. And once again, we're helpless watching another nightmare unfold. And that's the word, isn't it? Helpless. A lot of the world's problems can be solved with the allocation of more money or resources, or a change of international priorities. That's not to say they are solved, but they can be. Even with the enormous challenge of the climate crisis, there are at least steps that we can take. We have some power, even if we choose not to use it. But for conflicts like Ukraine and for Afghanistan, solutions are hard to find. In Ukraine, Vladimir Putin might be appeased with territorial gains, but in Afghanistan, what is it that will make the Taliban unclench its fist and release its iron grip on society, especially its women and girls? Since last March, we have seen decree after decree issued, which serves to diminish the rights of women and girls. Their imprint on Afghan society is becoming fainter and fainter, and it's hard not to draw the conclusion that that is the Taliban's ultimate aim. In early March, I had the absolute privilege to visit Afghanistan, and I can truthfully tell you that it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. I had been prepared for the beauty of the country, but the spectacular scenery of Bad Geese blew me away, and I know that that beauty is replicated right across the country. But it was also unspeakably sad, and this was before the recent slew of discriminatory decrees, because women there are invisible and becoming more so. As a Western woman, it was impossible not to notice how absent women are from every single aspect of Afghan society. There were no women depicted on billboards, no shops catering for women, at least none that I saw. I visited a camera store to get a visa picture taken, and even the pictures in the in the frames that were being sold depicted men only. It was really stunning to see. I couldn't see any women on the streets. Well, I saw one or two, but I have to be honest, the majority of the women that I did see on the streets in Kabul were begging. It was really, really sobering. And we say all the time that this is a man's world, but in Afghanistan, it really is. And I can't say that this inequality began last year with this latest Taliban takeover. Clearly, there has been a gender imbalance in Afghan culture for a long time, but it is being cruelly exploited by the Taliban. It's difficult not to look at what's happening in Afghanistan through the prism of my Westernness. And I tried not to, because it is a very different culture to what we in Europe are used to. However, I do worry about the long-term effect on society when women are treated so badly. What is the impact on a young boy when his mother has to cover herself in a burqa, when she has no autonomy over herself? She can't leave her house or travel without the company of a mahram or a male chaperone. She can't have a bank account. She can't work. The list of things that women can't do in Afghanistan is endless. And I have to ask, what is the long-term impact on that woman and on the people around her? Will her sons grow up to respect her and the contribution that women can make to society? Or will they perpetuate this idea that women are somehow less than? And I know there are many wonderful men in Afghanistan who are deeply pained by what is happening, by the treatment of their mothers, their wives, their sisters and their daughters. They too are being punished, caught in a painful bind by the Taliban and forced to be the jailers of the women in their lives. The truth of Afghanistan today is that everyone is hurting. The country is in crisis. Its economy is in tatters and its people are starving. In addition to malnutrition, there is an epidemic of measles, which is a treatable disease, but the country's healthcare is struggling. I used to say that Afghanistan was on its knees. Now I say that it has collapsed and it will not recover without international help and assistance. We have to reach out our hand and help it to its feet again, lend our support. While everyone in Afghanistan, men, women and children are suffering, it is the women and girls who are being targeted most right now. When I was there was hope that the Taliban was going to allow girls back into high schools for education. I visited a community school in the province of Maidan Wardak and saw scores of girls crammed into a tiny classroom. It was so densely packed that our tiny delegation had difficulty even getting into the room. The appetite that those girls had for education made me deeply ashamed. The way that we in the West take education for granted, that we moan about it. In Afghanistan, it is a precious privilege, and students there want to learn and succeed and make something of their lives. The girls we spoke to wanted to be lawyers, doctors, teachers, engineers, and they wanted to remain in the country and use their skills and education to make it great. The fact that those young women are being denied a high school education is heartbreaking and short-sighted to the point of blindness. The Taliban's controversial decision on female education was the first of many recent draconian measures over the last few months, and I fear we will hear more. Part of me wonders, what more can they do to women? But another part of me shudders, because they will find a way to further express their hatred and misogyny. Most recently came the diktat that female news presenters were to cover their faces while delivering the news. Only their eyes were to be exposed. And I have to ask, if women didn't need their eyes to see, would we have to cover ourselves entirely? And I wonder, if we weren't needed for procreation, would we have any use in Afghan society? So earlier this month, the female presenters on evening news bulletins appeared on television with half of their faces covered. And in fairness to their male colleagues, many of them wore masks to express solidarity and contempt for this utterly ridiculous order. I read the account of one newsreader, and it has haunted me. As a woman working in the media in Ireland, her words have haunted me. She describes the first time she had to wear a mask on air. She said it was the hardest day of her life, but the Taliban had made her and her colleagues feel that they were being buried alive. She didn't feel human and thought she had committed a huge crime. She must have done, because why else would God have made her a woman in Afghanistan? Right now, Afghanistan is hell for women and girls. The message that is being very deliberately sent out by forcing such visible female journalists to cover their faces, it's deeply sinister. Women that by their public presence on television would have reassured females right around the country that there was still a place for them in the country where they call home. That pretense is now being exposed as a lie, and the trace of women in Afghanistan is becoming even fainter. We cannot forget our sisters and our nieces in Afghanistan. Have a blessed day.
Thank you very much, Emer, again for a very insightful presentation. And as you said, a lot of what's happening is sinister, to put it mildly. And also, you pose a good question. If young boys grow up seeing this, what is their reaction going to be? Is it going to continue in perpetuity? And that brings me to a question. I'm going to ask each of you a question. And in answering the question, if there's something else you want to mention, do so. But the question I will ask first is to Dr. Humaira Razai. Dr. Razai, I am asking you in line with what Emer said. What could the EU do to improve its response to the crisis that has arisen in the Taliban in Afghanistan as a result of the Taliban takeover? Okay, Dr. Humaira.
Yes, so I think the EU. Thank you very much. That is a very important question. I think the EU can play a very important role to sort of deal with the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. I think first and foremost, there needs to be a very good monitoring of the human rights abuses in there, with a focus on a targeted attacks and specifically for marginalized groups such as women, Hazaras, and religious minorities. We need to ensure that these are documented and these are monitored, and so Taliban can be pressured to respect the internationally recognized human rights and humanitarian law. Unfortunately, with the lack of data that we had and we dealt with specifically when it came to targeted attacks against the Hazaras during the first regime, was a huge problem for us. And therefore, we need to ensure that this time round, all of the human rights abuses are going to be monitored. The Hazaras, as I explained earlier, who are targets and who are at risk of genocide under the Taliban regime, must be recognized as a vulnerable group by the EU. And another thing that we're seeing, unfortunately, now is an increase in discrimination against ethnic and religious minorities, again, specifically Shias, Sikhs, Hindus, and Hazaras. Even when it comes to humanitarian relief programs, they have discriminated against ethnic minorities. An example that I can give is in Daikundi, where it's a very Hazara-populated area. They have distributed the aid to the Taliban fighters instead of the local people. And also in cities like Ghazni, Hazaras are completely left out of aid distribution. There was a study that surveyed around, I think about 500,000 families from 1,116 villages. And they showed that out of these families, only 17.2% of the Hazaras from this study received aid, and the rest was completely left out. And therefore, when it comes to aid distribution, I think it's very, very important that Hazaras, women, people from different groups are involved in monitoring, in policy, in distribution, and in all aspects of the aid distribution. Currently, the aid distribution is very male-dominated. The policy is written by men. It's distributed by men. It's monitored by men. The local NGOs that work with a lot of, for example, with UN agencies, such as WFP, majority are run by men. And so it's vital that the international community are putting women in positions, and when it comes to everything, including specifically aid distribution. And another thing that we have to focus on is investment on women's health and healthcare provision, because the lack of access to healthcare and reproductive services are affecting women severely. And so, for example, the lack of access to contraception means birth rate will increase, which will increase poverty, infant and maternal morbidity and mortality in the country. Women are completely degraded in the society and within the families, and those who had jobs and income are no longer able to support their families. And so Taliban are creating this culture of male domination and toxic patriarchal society. And so support for women, from education to healthcare, it's vital. But when we talk about support, we have to ensure that these supports are done on local basis. I think that, for example, if an area or district it's a Uzbek dominated, then the local NGO must be Uzbek to ensure that they are reducing the discrimination against this group. Or if they are Sikh, from the Sikh community, then the help needs to be organized or given to the Sikh people and dealt by them, again, to ensure that there's going to be, or at least trying to reduce the discrimination in Afghanistan. Another thing that the EU could do is funding for diaspora organization. One of the things the international community, I think, did in Afghanistan for the past 20 years, or perhaps I could say a mistake that they made, was that they dealt only with one specific group in Afghanistan, and that was the dominant group who led and had the power in Afghanistan. And so a lot of the information and a lot of the reports that they were supposedly needs to be published were very, very much filtered. And therefore working and funding the diaspora organization, who have very good access to the local people, could help to ensure that the fundings in which they receive are actually being implemented and are received by the local people themselves. And so it's ensuring that the international community are no longer just dealing with one group of people in Afghanistan, ensuring that they are going to be engaged with different ethnic groups, religious groups, as well as women in Afghanistan, I think could potentially help us solve a lot of the problems that we're facing in Afghanistan. Yep. But overall, I think engaging with women and diaspora organizations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Humaira, for a very comprehensive answer. And now to Dr. Abdul. You relocated to Ireland. How would you assess the Irish response to the crisis? And have we given enough support? And can we do more?
Thank you. Yeah. And a person which came from a bad situation, arriving in Ireland, and it's fantastic, I can say, and they are supportive. And also they are all under load of people which they came from Ukraine or relocated from Ukraine, and that's also another case or another thing which we can mention. And and overall, they are supportive, and but there is something should be done, such as the movement is very slow, and it can be more faster, and also this is such kind of possibilities.
Thank you very much indeed. And now finally back to you, Emer. And you have reported from many crisis areas around the world. You're obviously very moved by what's happening in Afghanistan. It comes across in your presentation and in your voice and your emotions, and upset by it. Obviously, as a woman, that's very important. But how does the Afghan situation compare to other crisis zones you have reported from? Over to Emer.
Afghanistan is... Oh,
yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Can perfect now, yeah.
Afghanistan is obviously a very unique place. I think when I reported from there, one of the overwhelming things that I felt was that there was no one to help me, that there was no emergency services, no one I could turn to, no one on the end of a phone if I dialed 911. The Taliban is the government and they control everything. They provided our security. And that was quite suffocating because, you know, usually there is someone that you can turn to, but in Afghanistan, and this is what it's like for people all the time. So, you know, I was very fortunate. I was there for a week. You know, I could marvel at it and kind of feel a little bit of the way people felt, but I could also get in a plane and go. And that was different. I found that quite suffocating, I have to say. I also felt that people couldn't really speak the truth, tell you what they were thinking, which again is fair enough. I mean, the Taliban, I learned, could be quite petty. So, you know, if we interviewed a person, you know, the UNICEF spokesperson who was with us, because they were with us for a large portion of the time, they would come over and say, did she say anything? Did she give any indication of where she lived? Did she talk about her personal views? And you quickly got the feeling that, you know, the Taliban would retaliate if they were in any way criticized. So we learned very quickly not to ask people for their views or opinions, because the Afghans that we met were so lovely and were so welcoming and wanted to be so honest and hospitable to us, that had we asked them something, you know, they probably would have answered and we would have got them in trouble. So that was very different as well. It became quite difficult to find someone who would give you a sense of what was really happening. I mean, we spent, you know, a large portion of the time we were there with our driver and our security advisor. And, you know, by the end of the week, we got on brilliantly with them, but I still have no idea what their personal views are because they were so guarded. And I mean, finally, it goes full circle again. It's the lack of women in society. I just found that, I really could not get over that. One night, for example, we were driving through Kabul and the Taliban kept stopping cars. They were doing, they had these checkpoints and they were searching cars, and our car kept getting waved on. And I thought it was because we were Western, because myself and my cameraman were Western journalists, and they saw us and they moved us on. And the security guard, security advisor eventually turned around to me. He was in the front passenger seat and he said, "We're so lucky that you're here." And I said, "Oh, as a Western journalist." And he said, "No, as a woman, they won't stop women. It's not part of the culture because, you know, they don't believe that you would be a threat, that a woman would be a threat to them." I have to say that absolutely blew me away. It just, you know, there were so many things in that trip that I found quite staggering, but the fact that women weren't even taken seriously as threats just will stay with me. And, you know, I hope that there are women around the world, we can stand up for them and we can prove to the Taliban, we can show them that they were wrong in that.
Yeah, very good point, Emer, indeed. And it just shows you the level of backwardness, really, that there is in the Taliban. I mean, it's very hard to figure out how such a culture would exist today, and particularly that they would now come and implement this essential degradation, subjugation, denial almost of the existence of women, as you said, hardly there at all other than for procreation. So I think that at European Union level, we will have to focus more on what's happening in Afghanistan and maybe to try and orientate the response to the obvious terrible situation in Ukraine, to try and maybe move the two of them on parallel, because there is a tendency, obviously, that the Ukrainian situation is bigger, is more immediate, that the Afghan situation might be put in the background, and that's something we have to try and to avoid. So I would hope that a webinar like this and discussions here at European Parliament, that we can help, as you said, to keep pressure on the Taliban, so that first of all these terrible situations are continuously highlighted, and you gave some, all of you gave some harrowing examples there today, but then that there would be a political response as well as a humanitarian response to try and deal with the situation. So listen, thank you very much, Humaira, Abdul and for coming with us today and giving you presentations. I think it has been extremely worthwhile, and I wish you the best of luck. So to you again, Emer, Abdul and Nora, pleasure having you. And if we can help in any way, please keep in touch with us. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.